for writing code, I mean, I actually prefer ChatGPT.
You need to have like a basic understanding of like how your Go code compiles. You don't need to actually be able to do that by hand.
What will the job of a software developer even look like in 5
Yeah.
years, given that there is AI? Will this take our jobs?
I'm here with Natalie. She's one of the hosts of the Go Time FM podcasts, arguably the best Go podcast that I'm aware of. Certainly the largest. Is it the largest like Go specific podcast?
I want to say so.
Yeah, I think it is, at least that I'm aware of. And we had Matt on. It's been almost 8 months now. I want to get him back on. But you're also one of the hosts, and I'm super excited to have you on, in particular because you've been doing a lot of kind of, I don't know if research is probably the right word, research and testing, in particular with how the Go programming language fits in with AI driven development, right? Using LLMs.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm just super excited to have you on.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Cool. Well, you are, like I said, host of Go Time. You're the organizer of GopherCon EU.
Europe. We're more inclusive than just EU, not just the European
Okay.
Union, but all of Europe.
Okay, that makes sense. All of Europe. And you don't have to be European to go.
Exactly.
So even more inclusive than that. And you've been a senior Go developer of many years. Let's talk about your talk. So your talk is titled, I believe, AI-driven development in Go?
Yeah. This was, so it started at a talk I gave at GopherCon in the US. I want to say it was 2020 or 2021. It was definitely online during the COVID times, and this was the title.
2021, I believe. Like
Yes.
like this is before AI was like as hot as it is now.
Yes, 2021. And this was the title then, and this is a very dynamic field. So since then, I kind of gave again this talk, but very differently. So same idea, but there were so many developments that the content was different. So you can find this title on YouTube multiple times, but it's not the same talk. And then it was also it's interesting to go back to this talk, because then, for example, I say right now the Google trend is I wonder if it's going to be called MLOps or AIOps. Google trend shows this, Google trend shows that, and it's been long enough that it is MLOps. AIOps is like less of a thing. So it's I really enjoy watching this evolution, I mean.
Yeah. Can we define that? Can we define that term really quick? So MLOps, AIOps, this is like machine learning operations. What does that mean?
It's same DevOps we all know and love, but it's specifically for machine learning based systems. So something that would serve an LLM, something that would include some model interaction, which is mostly the same, but has some specific things that are a little bit different. And there's a very good paper written by groups, by 5 or 7 people from Google in 2015 about the technical debt of machine learning of based infrastructure. And it's still super relevant. It just now actually becomes production relevant. Until then, it was interesting. It's a fascinating article. It's like for AI, people say that it started with the all you need is attention, and this has kind of started the Transformers. That was that paper, and I think that this paper by the Googlers is what started MLOps.
So is it like specifically around the data engineering? Like how do we write code that gets data into models efficiently, or is it higher level?
Also considerations in serving models, how is monitoring different, because then you don't just serve, for example, you don't just monitor database connections and like users reaction time and so on, but you also have to think of other things like if there's a model that let's look at Amazon, for example. You have your shoppings, and then you have recommendations, and then you have the search results, and whatever will show in one will kind of affect the other, but they both are LLMs eventually that's powering that. Like it is some machine learning algorithms and models that power the recommendations and power the search results and so on. And it's different types of chain reactions. Or for example, there's something that's called feature. Like if it's a platform where you search for an apartment, then a feature is the number of rooms. And so you have to think of how different features affect the performance of the system and so on, and coupling between them. So it's just adding new set of configurations, but because everything is, we're moving from big data, which was the cool thing 10, 15 years ago. Now it's like AI is the cool thing. Our system deals with AI, it has AI. So it's just this new world of considerations. This is MLOps.
You mentioned that so like the Amazon search bar, right?
Hmm.
It has AI built in. That's how it does recommendations. Like I've always understood that that's more broadly speaking machine learning. Is it true that they're actually using LLMs like GPT 3.5 or GPT 4 to power that, or is it different?
I don't know, but I would bet they don't use GPTs, and they probably don't use generative AI. They probably use other types of machine learning, like recommendations,
Got it. Okay.
which is another a parallel category to generative AI. It doesn't generate; it just ranks by search results or finds what's
Yeah.
most relevant to recommend.
Obviously, there's been huge advances in AI over the last few years, and especially in the hype surrounding AI. But
And Gen AI.
right, and generative AI. Like, I guess my perception, and this is what I want to get your take on. My perception has been that like machine learning for recommendation systems, like it's
Mhm.
probably improved in the last 2 to 3 years, but it hasn't been this like giant step function where it's gotten so much better than it was 2 to 3 years ago. Whereas with generative AI,
Mhm.
LLMs, it's been this
Mhm.
like massive leap forward.
Yep. Yep. I would agree with this.
When you started writing your talk, so AI driven development in Go, is it more about using Go to do the data engineering that allows us to build better models, or is it more about generating Go code with LLMs, like using Copilot or ChatGPT to help you write code?
It's the latter. Although I think there is this bidirectional relationship, this talk focuses more on why AI generated code will be better in Go versus any other language. Go is not only awesome in all the different things that it already has to offer, like cross compilation and all the other cool things that are there, like the built in concurrency and so on, but also the fact that the linters part of the language that you that will always look the same visually, for example, already makes the training data set a lot more consistent. And in training models, more data points is of course good, but the higher quality actually matters more than the number or the amount of data. So because Go code always looks like it's machine generated,
Mm,
because of the formatting and so on, it will not
yeah.
look weird, or it will take you a lot longer to figure out that this was written by a machine because it always looks the same anyway. That's one feature, for example.
Right. Okay, so like in JavaScript, there's 7 different popular ways to write a loop to like iterate over a list, right? Like you've got for const of like the for loop thing. You've got like the for loop where you increment I, kind of like the standard C for loop. You've got the for each built-in function. Whereas in Go, it's like there's 2 ways, I guess. Like you can increment I or you can use the range keyword, and like that's pretty much it. Is
Hmm.
this what we're talking about?
It's that, but it's also the fact that it's the curly brackets always come at the end of the line. The new line
Mm,
is, it's not like new line and then, while in any other language or most of other languages, do what you want.
yeah.
And then, for example, you can kind of expect from a human written code that it will be different, but it will not. The start and the end of the block will look the same. That you don't expect them to be different, but because the training data is so inconsistent, it can happen that AI generated one will be inconsistent even in the same block.
Right. So it's just that much easier to do. So, okay, so part of it is so that's like a feature of GoFumped almost, right?
Hmm.
Very standard formatting. You could argue that if you just trained on like Python Black, then you'd get the same thing in Python. Or if you just use like standard, prettier formatting in JavaScript, that you'd get the same thing. Is there anything else that also makes Go a good language for for AI generated code?
Yep, the fact that the Go way of things is to import less and rely mostly on the standard library. And if a solution is not there, then you will not go and search for whatever import it is, but you will write that in code. Teaches the AI that in AI generated code, you don't go and dream up libraries and
Yeah.
import things that don't exist. But you actually go and write that. And it's good in two things. One is functionality, that you can assume that the code that you write is more likely to actually work because you don't have to go and check for the imports. But it also keeps you more safe in the perspective of security and hacking. One of the
Yeah.
very first breaches that came in the context of LLMs is that there was a security researcher that noticed that in specific code blocks in Python that are very, like in the very basic ones, first 2-3 lines that it almost always auto-completed one of 2 libraries that didn't exist.
Really?
He took one of them, claimed ownership on one of them, and didn't put there anything special, but he just claimed ownership on that and said, kind of, I have this. And then he went and released and said that, if I were a hacker, many people would be in trouble. And he did show how it's generating the same, like, very consistently the same one of 2 libraries.
Wait, so it was I want to understand this. It was generating a library that doesn't actually exist, and then he went and claimed ownership of like that
Exactly.
namespace.
Not just that, but he noticed that it very consistently generates one of 2 libraries, which is probably like a mix of some 2 formatting libraries or
It's
string or
like
something that you
pandas and
use always.
NumPy or something.
Could be. I
Yeah.
forget the exact details, but it's like a mix of 2 things that are popular but doesn't exist.
That's so why would it generate something that doesn't exist? It must be like similar in naming.
Training data, right? When the standard library for strings, for math, for whatever in Go is always the same, it will not take 2 and try to like merge it into something funny.
Oh, so it was taking like 2 real names and like creating a new
Dreaming
name.
up the third one, yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I've ran into this problem a lot actually, particularly in JavaScript, where I'll be like asking ChatGPT, you know, for syntax to do something, and it will just spit out code that's clearly using a library. It'll be like some library name
Mm-hmm.
dot, right? In Python, like anti-gravity dot. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
all of the details that I wanted it to generate are just it's just assuming that I have a library to do all this the stuff that I asked it to do.
Mm-hmm.
I know there was a problem with GPT-4 Turbo where it was like being lazy. Are you aware of this problem?
There was a recent tweet by Sam Altman that said that now the user experience became better again. So, I mean, that's development. We always try. We sometimes break things. We sometimes improve things. I think it's a weird expectation to expect this to always be better nonstop.
Right. I'm just saying, like, so to give everyone a little bit of context, when we're talking about like an LLM being lazy, it's like you ask the LLM, hey, can you generate me some code, I don't know, for a binary tree, right? And instead of giving you the full binary tree class, it like stubs out the functions and like comments and puts like insert method here. And you're like, no, like I
Mm-hmm.
wanted you to give me the whole thing. Like, why are you being lazy? Another form of laziness I've seen is like in a language like JavaScript or Python. I've seen less of this with Go, is where it'll just like it won't like comment and say put your code in here, but it will just call a library that doesn't exist and assume that the library
Mm-hmm.
has whatever code you need to do the hard thing that you wanted it to generate in the first place.
Yeah, that's generally a behavior that can happen even after the improvements. And I'm teaching an O'Reilly course about once a month on how to boost software development with AI. And one of the things that, like, some of the tricks that I recommend there is to, before starting everything, like the very beginning of your conversation with ChatGPT would be, what is the Go way of doing things? What are some best practices? What is idiomatic Go? And then it lands into the context of Go, and then actually do this in iterations. So I actively ask for it, give me a scaffold program that does this and that. And then we iterate function by function to fill this functionality. Because lazy or not, I think it will still take a moment to understand what each and every one does. And now, for example, ChatGPT has extra features like custom instructions where you give context about yourself and how would you like the conversation to go, but it also has memory. So you can say, always remember that I want the full code. Always remember that I want a scaffold. Long answer, short answer, with explanation, without, and so on. So it still learns kind of this personalization and will get better with time. But until then, I find this hand holding helps a bit more.
Yeah. One of the biggest time sinks I've found is exactly that, where like you need to sit and prompt ChatGPT, for example, at the beginning
Mm-hmm.
of the conversation into what you want it to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've had some success by creating custom GPTs. So
Mm-hmm.
like I made a custom GPT that's like always super concise. Like it basically just gives me the raw whatever I'm asking for. It just like spits
Mm-hmm.
out raw code or spits out like the documentation. Have you created like a custom GPT to do this like beginning prompting that you're talking about when you're, writing Go code with an LLM?
For some use cases, yes. For example, there was a grant from the city of Berlin I was applying for. So I made a custom GPT specifically for that because it was like a set of 5 PDFs written by people who were like probably faxed it or something. So
Yeah.
it's definitely it's really good answer or solution when you need to solve something specific. Generally, for me, it helps thinking of GPTs as apps. Then it like,
As
or
individual
phone apps.
applications?
Yeah, like apps on your phone. It has one thing that it does really well, and you don't need to do all the heavy lifting of programming a mobile app. You just have to kind of preload it with knowledge once, and then it always kind of keeps your progress and so on.
So a lot of software development over the last 15 years has been focused on like, this is almost like the more business side of software, but it's been focused on taking like some manual process that people were using
Mm-hmm.
like general software for, like Excel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like building a SaaS tool that's very specific to that problem, right? So you maybe accountants were just using like Excel and paper to do their
Mm-hmm.
accounting and like billing, and now they use a SaaS application that really at the end of the day is just like CRUD and some math. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
very simple piece of software, but it does like automate a whole process that people did have to set up manually in Excel. Do you think GPTs will affect the SaaS industry by making it so that you don't have to spend so much time just like hard coding different logical paths in your SaaS? Like you kind of just, I don't know, build a better user experience or a better prompt around a, large language model?
I definitely think it will help a lot of that. A problem that I see with current GPTs, and I do think it will change in the future. Don't know any development plans, of course. Is the UI. Like right now, the way to interact with GPTs, it's still having a chat with ChatGPT, and most people got used to that. Like many people are used to that, and that works. And when you give that extra knowledge, they're even happy to use that. But still, a lot of SaaS tools are about like this is a website that only does this. So either we will transition to getting used to ChatGPT, which I don't think will happen, or there will be some UI layer on top of that in one of the future updates, which I think might happen.
You're
And
saying a
then it
UI
will even
layer
more.
on top of like released by OpenAI, not like apps
Mhm.
building a UI around the chat completions API.
I mean, right now, this is actually what's happening. The apps are building UI around the Chat GPT API. The problem is that with every large update from OpenAI, it eats up some of those apps that are all they do is a very thin wrapper.
Yeah.
So, for example, when I'm doing OpenAI office hours and people come with an idea and ask for feedback, I tell them like, what is the extra thing that you have other than just a wrapper?
Right.
Because, for example, half a year ago or 1 year ago, there was no ChatGPT app, and like one of the leading apps in the App Store was just literally an app that lets you speak with ChatGPT, and then OpenAI released an app, and then like this was gone. Or there were lots of assistants on top of that, and then they released the assistants API, and then it's like, well, now I'm gonna have to
Yeah.
find something else. So it's important that you do something that is more than just a thin wrapper.
Well, that makes sense. And I think getting the user experience right is going to be where actual productivity gains
Hmm.
happen, because like for example, like when I'm writing Go code, I've been doing it for enough years that if I know what I want to write, it's usually just the process of like typing the
Hmm.
characters out. And so for me, like Copilot has been great because a lot of times it can save me a bunch of keystrokes, right?
Hmm.
um yeah, like sometimes I'll autocomplete and then I have to like back up. It's like, I did the wrong thing, or I'll waste a little bit of time. But generally speaking, I've found that like the saving of the keystrokes is more productive than I would have been otherwise. Whereas when I was like playing with Chat GPT pre Copilot,
Hmm.
even though the answers were just as good as Copilot, if not better, to be honest, in some cases, especially the early versions of Copilot. Even though the answers were better, like it didn't save me all that many keystrokes because I'd have to like copy paste from my editor into
Hmm.
Chat GPT, copy the thing back out, paste it back in. So it was like all the productivity gains were actually just gone. But the
Hmm.
integration into my editor is like what made me actually start using it more. Where do you see the future of this like, integration with LLMs and developer experience going?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and also in my mind, it connects also to the question of what will the job of a software developer even look like in five
Yeah.
years, given that there is AI. Will this take our jobs? And I think it will introduce another layer of abstraction on what we do. And this will be the new user or developer experience, that you like right now your experience with ChatGPT or with Copilot is that you type and it auto completes, or maybe you have a chat on what's actually happening there. And I can imagine that in a couple of years it will be smart enough to understand from the context of the repo, of the code, of the other files that you have in the repo, and maybe of even more of like the documentation website or something like this. So the context, for example, window will grow to put to help you take better decisions. And then you will be having even more abstract conversations and abstract instructions. Like you will not just say for X and then complete this, but you'll say count all new members, whatever. Like it will go to an abstraction layer that you don't even need to think of the syntax.
So I want to hear what you think about this theory that I have. Here's one of my theories. Sometimes it's easier to write a thing in code than it is to precisely say in English what you want
Hmm.
to be done. Explaining how to write a function that calculates the Fibonacci sequence in English might actually be like more tokens to type than
Hmm.
like the Python version of that function. And so I have this continued reservation that like pure plain English will be the way that we write code in the future, but that it might look more like, you know, some high level pseudocode or something, especially in like the intermediate term. And I think that for a very long time, probably I say very long, like decade plus, I certainly can't predict longer than that, but like decade plus, I think as developers we'll at least be like looking and inspecting code, even if it's like generated with AI. I think we'll still be like working with the code rather than, you know, you imagine like a sci-fi future where you're just like saying words at a computer and like everything that happens after that is binary. And if you want to know what's going on, you ask the computer and it like tells you back in English. And my reasoning is like we'll still want to be able to inspect like the executable output, the thing that's going to run in production. What do you think about all this?
I think it's definitely interesting, and I think it makes sense that we will want to inspect before releasing to production and so on. I have similar thoughts in the kind of expectations from the future. I think one difference is that the Fibonacci example, I don't think you'll be saying like if this, then this, like here's the algorithm. You will just say to the Fibonacci sequence. Or usually it will be a bit more related, like more boring, less challenging, and more in the context. Like the context will be a lot more important than the technical details, and it will be because it will be better in taking the context. It will be executing well something like, you know, product said now we add support for integration with this, and here's the API, generate the functions, and from here it will take it to do it on its own. And when I think of that and trying to of such a scenario and trying to think what will be the like how much relationship will I have still with the written code, I'm thinking of assembly,
Hmm.
the programming language that
Yeah.
is take a register, put a value, move it to that register, jump, and kind of those very basic commands. In the past, somewhere between punch cards and like abstract programming languages, this is how programming was. And I can imagine that with the introduction of C and other languages, people had the same like, I'm going to write that abstraction of here's a loop, but I'm also going to look at the registers to make sure it executes this correctly. But then at some point, new people came and stopped doing that. Never learned.
Right.
I don't know if the people who used to write assembly at what point of their life they let go of that. I'm sure that for very important code, people were still looking at that, but for more and more people were just like, I'm fine with writing for and trust that the registers move correctly. And doing this analogy, I can imagine that writing add this API support, figure out which of the functions we need to implement and write that. And here you will be at the level of not looking at the registers, but also not looking at the characters that make the code. There
Yeah.
will be some test suites, just like now there's also a test suite for whatever we write in C or whatever we write in Go, but it will be this abstract testing suite.
I think there's like this vanishing gradient of like how far down the abstraction layer you need to understand in order to like get your job done. And to
Mm.
be clear, like the larger the organization, you might need different people with specialties at different layers of
Hmm.
abstraction. But like take web development, for example, front end, back end, full stack web development. I would argue to be like a senior web developer, you need to be like very competent at the highest level of abstraction, right? So you're writing like Go on the back end, HTML, CSS, JavaScript on the front end. And then you need to have like a basic understanding of like how your Go code compiles. Like you don't need
Hmm.
to actually be able to do that by hand, right?
Hmm.
But you need to
Hmm.
kind of understand how it does it and what performance implications there are. Same with like on the front end, you need to understand how, you know, the DOM is parsed by the browser, how rendering cycles work. So you have to go down the level of abstractions, like so, something like vanishing gradient. And it seems like every time a new layer of abstraction is introduced, like now you need to learn the new one, and you
Hmm.
still need to know like a couple layers down. So like I guess my belief at the moment, and it's just a belief, I guess prediction is probably the better word,
Hmm.
is that we'll be generating a lot more code with AI over the next 10 years.
Hmm.
But for at least the next 10 years, being able to understand what the code does is still going to be a necessary skill to be a software engineer, because otherwise it'll be really unproductive. Like
Hmm.
when it
For
stops
sure.
working, like you won't know how to debug it and fix it and like reprompt the LLM to get what you actually need.
Yeah, yeah, I think this is making a lot of sense.
Circling way back, you'd mentioned this bidirectional relationship between Go and LLMs. So we've talked about how you can use an LLM to generate Go code, and because of some of the unique properties of the Go programming language, that works pretty well compared to other languages. What's the other side of this bidirectional relationship?
AI based or AI based systems that are serving Gen AI or any variation of that. Go is a great choice for writing such systems. And the reason for that is pretty much the same reason that this is a great choice for e-commerce or for blockchain and fintech in general and so on. That it's very good in doing things fast, efficiently, parallelly, and separating it to multiple small tasks and executing all together. Basically, kind of the reason that it's also used for all the DevOps tools out there, that it's easily cross-compilable to all sorts of systems. Who knows how will the chip industry look in a couple of years? Like right now, OpenAI is raising money to do their chip factory, but also NVIDIA is doing something with their own AI supercomputer. And then, like, between that, all the AI software and hardware kind of merges into one. So we will keep cross compiling into new architectures, new operating systems, and this amazing feature of Go will be super useful also for this.
Sam Altman didn't get the 7 trillion that he wanted, did he? Do you
As
know what
far
I'm
as I
talking
know,
about?
not yet. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I think he's working on doing some. It's a lot of money to raise. I think he's working still on building the group of people who will go for that.
Yeah, it's not just a lot of money to raise. It's like, isn't it like the market cap of like Apple and Google and Microsoft combined or something like that? It's like these companies are worth just like a couple $1 trillion each, and to raise $7 trillion, yeah, I don't know all the details, but seems bonkers.
But yet you see the fluidity between the software and the hardware of AI focused companies. So
Yeah,
something is going to change in the world of AI chips. Like there will be probably some AI chips that are not just TPUs or GPUs. So new stuff will come. And that cross
yeah,
compilation will be useful for that as well. But even before we talk about chips, just all the features of Go that make it really good to be web,
yeah,
like to serving web systems, is already making it a great choice.
yeah. That makes sense. I mean, it's like all the things we talk about on this podcast all the time, like static compilation, cross compilation. Is there any feature of Go that you would say is suboptimal? Like, is there something that would need to change to make it even better for AI generated code?
I don't know if there is support right now for, again, back to cross compilation to TPUs or GPUs.
Mm, that makes sense.
I also expect that there will be some focus on low level languages that are specific to this. So NVIDIA has CUDA, which is their chip specific programming language. And I can imagine some adaptation of Go specifically to like move to CUDA better, or like to work with some bindings between the two languages will be cool to have as well for the specific purpose.
So I know nothing about CUDA. Do you like compile down to CUDA and then CUDA executes natively? Like, is it like an assembly type language? Like,
It's been a minute since I graduated university with that project.
sorry to put you on
um,
the spot.
Let me chat GPT that. Yeah, it says you can use Go to interface Go with CUDA.
So there's some sort of interoperability, I'm guessing.
Yep. Something that will take the Go out of the way will make this even more efficient for that direct interface.
Okay, so let's talk about chips for just a second then.
I'm excited about chips because my first job was at Intel. So, and my graduation project was on one was on GPUs.
Okay, I know
Um,
nothing about chips, so this will be fun. I know
And
CPUs do CPU things and GPUs do graphics things, and
and
there's
then there's
something with
TPUs that Google invented for their AI things, because already 10 years ago, I forget when TPUs were invented, but they already knew that tensor processing units will be a cool thing because tensors is what moves AI.
tensor processing units. So a tensor is like a vector? Is it like for doing the large matrix math?
It's a large matrix math, and the tensor is a multi-dimensional array. So it's like a
Okay.
vector, but array and multi-dimension.
Yeah, so it's like to hopefully try to help visualize for our listeners. So it's like you've got an array. We all know an array. It's like a list of numbers. Matrix would be a two-dimensional array, right? So an array of arrays. And when we say
Like a sheet.
n-dimensional, yeah, it's like you just keep doing that. You've got an array of arrays,
A
right?
three-dimensional is like Rubik's Cube, and that's where our imagination ends.
Yeah, and then we can't visualize it anymore. But like the computer can keep going because you can have
Hmm.
an array nested 5 times deep. So that's what a tensor is then?
Yep, tensor is a multi-dimensional array representation of numerical values.
So is the difference between a TPU and a GPU just that the GPU like is optimized for like 2D and 3D and the tensor goes
Exactly, it's
farther?
optimized for different things, and the TPU is optimized specifically for this. I think both are optimized specifically for floating points, which
Okay.
CPU isn't. CPU supports floating point, but GPU does that a lot better.
Got it. We're gonna like I promise we're not going to do any weird crypto shilling, but I have to I have to make the analogy to crypto really quick. So in the early days of Bitcoin, people were using like the very early days, people were using CPUs to mine Bitcoin. And then pretty quickly everybody shifted to GPUs because it was
Hmm.
more power efficient. And then
It's
fairly quickly
matrix
after
multiplication. It's literally the same, yeah.
yeah, and then fairly quickly after that, companies started releasing ASICs, application specific integrated circuits. So it's like they built a SHA-256 hashing machine, right? Like it's just designed to like do SHA-256 hashes as fast as it can. Is that basically what a TPU is, or do we like yet to have the hardware that's truly optimized for LLMs?
TPU is very specific to tensors. Google at the time was focusing a lot on TensorFlow,
Okay.
which is their machine learning ecosystem. Since then, they, I would say, changed, and now there's also, with a focus on Gen AI, there's also Vertex, and there's also Gemini. But at the time, tensors were kind of the big efficient way of doing that. So it's a little bit like GPU. The GPU is really good in matrix multiplication, and TPUs are good in taking this multi-dimensional arrays and then doing all the math, which is also math, but it's not necessarily matrix multiplication. When your brain speaks faster than you. Um,
Fox and socks. Yeah.
and then those TPUs, when they go through neural networks, for example, each node is some mathematical manipulation, but it's not necessarily this or that. So it's doing those specific type of, not specific type of mathematical operations as much as the dimensions and the size of the format of the tensor.
I think it's easy to underestimate how much the performance and the hardware matters here because like just for example, if we take any common workflow that involves AI right now, so like ChatGPT, Midjourney for image generation, Sora for video, if you could drop like the generation time of any of those systems to instant or like near instant, like all of a sudden it goes from like a fairly useful thing to like an incredibly useful thing that you're going to use all like if I could snap my fingers and generate 1000 mid-journey images with different variations and very quickly cycle through them to get to different ones, like all of a sudden that tool becomes way better than it is now because right now it's like you can generate one at a time and it takes about 40 seconds for each one. Does the usefulness of AI just like directly scale with is are we just dependent on like breakthroughs in physics and hardware engineering to see like where we're going to be in 5 years, or is it still mostly like the transformer leap was really like a software or algorithm leap, right? Are we more looking forward to software innovation or hardware innovation at this point?
I think both. I think to reach AGI, you need the software innovation, but for everybody to be able to get faster results, it's the hardware that's missing. But think of, this is actually another added value of Go that we, by the way, like that reminded that it doesn't have that 10 minutes compilation time. You know, that meme of the XKCD, the famous one,
Yeah,
they're
the
playing
sword
swords in the
fighting.
office, the code's compiling. Well, in Go, it doesn't have this excuse. And yeah, one day we'll be there with AI.
The other like thing that needs to scale, in my opinion, to like truly make AI useful for like writing code is the context window. So
Hmm.
just like 2 months ago, most of us were working with an 8,000 token context window with
Hmm.
GPT-4, which, I mean, 8,000 tokens, you could fill that up quick. I believe, man, I could be wrong, but I believe it's just like a couple pages of text.
Kind of.
It's like somewhere
It's not
between
not
1 and
always a
20
whole file.
pages.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
always like a one code file. Yeah.
Right. And so like if you sometimes you can't even fit one file into it. You could almost never fit an entire repository of
Hmm.
files into it. Certainly if you wanted to give it like all the Git history and everything on top of that as well. But like it's pretty easy to imagine if you had an infinitely sized context window, all of a sudden you'd expect much better completions, right? And like you said, maybe, maybe you could give it a ticket written by a product manager and get something reasonable, but you need that like gigantic context window. Do you think it's likely that within 5 years we have context windows, or maybe even it's a system where you can like fine tune an LLM on your code base? Like, do you think those things are coming quickly, or do you think it's going to take a while?
I think all those things are coming quickly. The fine tune LLM on your code base. This is a project I worked on with a friend in 2021. Like before there was Copilot, we
Wow.
tried to do this. We even like raised some seed money, but it just became a pet project. But uh, not even obviously a competition to Copilot, but the idea was there. And this entire conversation is kind of lots of analogies to the beginning of computing and like the development of software in general. But I also see another analogy here. Talking about context windows now is like talking about memories in the 80s and the 90s, right?
Mm,
There's that quote that allegedly Bill Gates said that nobody will need more than 32 kilobytes of memory, and now
yeah.
we're like terabytes. So context window is the same. We're now in the kilos. It will grow.
I remember I was pretty young. I think I was like 7 or 8 at the time, and we had like a computer guy living on the street.
Hmm.
This is like you had like the computer guy living on the
Hmm.
street. My dad was not the computer guy, but we bought a
Install this
computer.
software for me.
Yeah, exactly. We bought a computer, and the computer guy down the street was like, "Oh, you have, I want to say it was 512 like megabytes of RAM." He was like, "You
Hmm.
or sorry, megabytes of hard drive." 512
Fancy.
megabytes of hard drive? Like you're never going to fill that up. That's such an incredible amount of space. It's like, bytes, kilobytes, megabytes, each of those is an order of 1,000. Like you'll never fill that up. That's
Hmm.
crazy.
Hmm.
Now like 512 megabytes of RAM isn't enough to open Chrome, it feels like.
Not
So
a Docker update, yeah.
yeah. I'm very interested if how we think about context windows in 5 years, because I do feel like that will be one of the biggest paradigm shifts in what's possible with LLMs at the moment.
But I feel it will also be the same conversation as we have now, like 1 terabyte, 2 terabytes. Like it's just going to be some, at most, couple of minutes that you think about it and the financial trade off, and then you move on.
Yeah. So, how do you personally use AI in your workflow? Like, you still write code day to day? How do you use AI?
For writing code, for personal things, I generally my job, I don't have a job. I'm a freelancer who's doing 17 things because that's how I'm the most productive. But for each one of those 17 things, I'm using AI. For writing code, I mean, I actually prefer ChatGPT. I like Copilot
Oh,
less. I
really?
tried, yeah. I do this copy paste, but I feel like I developed that feeling for what is the context that's needed. It's a little bit like you develop a feeling of how to write a good email. It's just you do this enough, you make enough mistakes, and you understand what should be there and what should not be there. And so that's for the code part. But for example, for organizing GopherCon, I had a chance of trying GPTs when it was last year, I think, we started the ticket sale. And we're using Stripe for that. And the Stripe has a very long documentation, and they recently made some changes in the reporting and so on. And it's like relying on the API and then doing things, and then features added, features removed. So I just dropped a lot of the Stripe documentation into a GPT, so into a custom GPT. And then we were having the conversation of like what the code should be updated to. This was super useful for me.
When you're writing code specifically, how much code do you type and how much code do you generate?
I more generate than type.
Really?
Yeah.
In ChatGPT, like in the window?
In the window, yeah. I carry it around, and then sometimes like if I need to iterate on something, I would only maybe copy the part that needs a repair, or just in the conversation even just focus on this and do that. But like when it's a project from scratch, it's very easy to do this thing with the scaffold, but most projects are not from scratch that you actually join into, so you have to kind of do this handwork of collecting all that context until the context window will be large enough. So that's why I feel like I'm typing less and I'm more directing.
This is super interesting to me because for me this is not the case at all. Like I still type 80 to 90% of the code that I'm writing when I'm just like doing my coding work. Like I said, I generate some with Copilot when it's applicable. I just autocomplete, and when I'm working with ChatGPT, I'm actually more using it. Like I'll use it to generate something a little longer, and then I usually
Hmm.
like copy paste it in, like have to edit it. Or occasionally I'll like ask a question about documentation because especially if it's a popular library, that's faster than going and trying to dig through the website. You're generating more code. Is that faster? Like, is it really faster for even just like smaller tweaks? Or is it like all greenfield stuff? Like, what is it about the process that makes it faster to ask ChatGPT?
Honestly, I think this is the working environment. I think the fact that I don't do this in Copilot, in like in my IDE using Copilot, but in the chat, it almost like, because it's new. If I would keep using VS Code, I will keep typing because that's what like my muscle memory draws me. I look at this and I'm like starting to type because I'm used to that. ChatGPT is a new UI for me. It's a lot more conversation. Also, I think it's just like a mental switch.
So, do you keep like one conversation ongoing for a long time, and that's your like feedback loop of like writing code?
I try to have sort of conversation per topic. Like if we're now adding one feature that does one thing, it will be a conversation. But if in the same code base it's a different feature, for example, I would open a new conversation.
So like a conversation per branch, per pull request.
Sort of, yeah, yeah. That's a very good analogy. Yeah.
Huh.
But then
And
you still have to think about the merges and so on. So it's not always going to work. Maybe there will be Git for for ChatGPT conversations. Who knows?
like I've tried to build some scripts using the OpenAI API, which like really is, pretty much the same as ChatGPT without the UI.
Yeah,
Um,
without the prompt. That's the
well,
biggest difference.
is there like a hidden built-in prompt to the ChatGPT that's
Hmm.
apart from GPT-4?
Hmm.
Oh,
GPT-4
I
is the
didn't know that.
underlying model that you're using, and then I don't think there's official information what is the prompt, but there's many people who kind of reverse engineered it, and OpenAI never commented yes or no.
I assumed that that system prompt that you're talking about was also being used in the API, like that they like didn't let you use it without the system prompt.
The system prompt it's a variable you can use.
Right. Sorry. This is where I'm definitely learning that I'm wrong. But my assumption was even if I used the API, there was like a hidden system prompt because like I can provide my system prompt, but my assumption was there's also a system hidden prompt that OpenAI has used. So that's not the case. Like I'm off the rails when I'm using the API.
I mean, I don't know if you're speaking directly to the metal. There must be some filters, whatever. I don't know to say that there's a content that there's a prompt or not.
Because
But
I
I think
imagine like
it's
all the like racism catches and like that kind of stuff, like that's still there in the
yeah,
API,
exactly,
right?
filters and so on. But I wouldn't know if it's because it's like from the internet, which is not official information. The prompt behind ChatGPT is sort of along the lines of you're very useful and eager to help assistant and so on. And this does not
Okay.
exist in the API.
Interesting. Interesting. I had no idea. Now I want to go do some more research because that does actually change how I work with the tooling a little bit. But you do use the UI, so you are getting that like system prompt when you're doing your work.
The problem with the UI is that there's a rate limit, and I hit it quite fast, quite often, and then I have to switch to the playground.
Oh,
The playground is actually using the API raw, pretty
yeah.
much. It's the same. It's just in the UI.
It's like a postman for the
Yes, very
ChatGPT
much.
UI, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Huh. Okay. Because what I was going to say is like I use I've tried to build scripts using the CLI to make some useful tools for my local development. Things where like rather than having to copy paste a whole file out of my editor into ChatGPT, maybe I could just type the name of the file and have that
Mhm.
like automatically added to the context window of the conversation. And so far, like I might just be a bad TUI designer, but so far I haven't been able to make anything that's actually made me more productive.
It's also still hard with a context window that is still not enough. Yeah.
Yeah,
This is a temporary problem and it's just not worth solving. It will
right.
go away soon enough, I think.
Okay, so now the selfish part of the conversation for me is like how should we think about training software developers now? Because when I learned to code, in like 2008, 2009, 2010, 2012, and I learned to code at that time kind of like it was 1999, 2001, 2002, like everything was like a decade behind. How should we be changing our coding curriculums now to focus on more important things? The way I look at it is you've got like concepts you want to teach a developer, things like algorithms, data structures, object
Design
oriented
patterns.
programming, design patterns, and then you've got like syntax. How does AI change everything?
So I think the first group of things you said is still important. And I think syntax is way less important. I think teaching how to actually use prompts, how to like reach the best thing in the fewest iterations maybe, or because it is also a matter of resources. Um how to find the right context that you give to it is also important, because in your mind you hold kind of all the conversations you ever had about the project. If you'll add a feature like this, then I don't know, your manager will reply like that, the product person will say like this, the sales team, the QA, like all the people you ever talked with in the product, around the product, hold a lot of context in your mind that we're not even aware of.
You have your own giant context window.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's quite the mental load to carry around. So thinking also of how to transfer that to whatever LLM it is you're talking with will be a skill. So prompt engineering is a good skill, but also context is a good skill. Gauging in general, kind of understanding when does it begin to hallucinate or forget or like being all over the place, and saying either we restart or you say like circling back, kind of catching that. So some feel for syntax will be still good, even just to the level that you can read and understand what is going on. And I can compare that to whenever, like, if you want to optimize something in your code, you're going to go to a tracing tool or something like this, and you don't need to know low level computing to fully understand what's going on, but you need to understand some basics. So you need to have the very basic foundation, but you need something if you want to go to optimizations. And so the equivalent of this is kind of understanding enough syntax in whatever language that is. Maybe there'll be one computer language. Maybe it will be Go, maybe not. So you'll be able to read and kind of stay on top of things whenever you do need to do the sampling. But this will be kind of like a monitoring skill. It will not be the main skill.
Yeah. I've been struggling with this because we teach a lot of, or I should say, we help a lot of students learn to code on Boot Dev, and we try to take this like really deep fundamentals first approach
Hmm.
with all the concepts we just talked about, data
Hmm.
structures, functional programming, whatever. And for a long time, I've been telling students like my belief is like don't spend too much time memorizing syntax. Like you
Hmm.
really don't need to be able to recall all of the tokens of a for loop in Go. You will eventually just be able to do that, right? If you just keep writing code. Like you don't need to sit and like try to memorize with flashcards how these things work. And like one trend I see with AI is that I think that becomes even more true. Like you just don't need to memorize as much stuff. And like
Hmm.
you could argue that programming underwent a similar shift like with the internet in the sense that
Hmm.
like you didn't need to have a book with bookmarks like all
Hmm.
strewn throughout the books like reminding you all of the different pieces of syntax that you'd need to know. It's like, okay, now you can just have a general idea, and when you need to remember what that piece of syntax is, you can Google it really quick and it's like at your
Hmm.
fingertips. To me, LLMs seem, at least in the short to medium term, more like that, where you can not bother with memorizing every little bit. You still need to internalize the fundamentals so that you can you can read things, you understand how and where to make changes when you need to. But it seems to me that LLMs are just going to keep pushing the like memorization is a useless skill uh,
Absolutely.
down the road.
I'm on board with that. So, like, knowing the syntax is just a nice to have it at some point. Understanding how systems interact with each other, like developing this overarching view of the whole thing. Like, this is our system. This is our web server. This is maybe some microservices around it. These are APIs we're using. Again, depending if you want to be like somebody who's building things fast, or do you want to focus on being a person who's good at optimization, then maybe focus on understanding a little bit of hardware versus on just having your five things that will like get your website out of the door by the end of the day. This is becoming a little bit of like what is it that you're excited to do, but the basics of a kind of seeing a system as a whole versus this is the piece of code that I'm working on still will be useful, because whenever a feature, a bug will come up, you want to quickly pinpoint that.
So memorization of small implementation details becomes less important. Architectural understanding, it sounds like you're saying, is kind of maybe becoming more important. Is that it? Are there any other takeaways that we can think about in terms of what we should be teaching more of, what we should be teaching less of, what we should be focusing more or less on?
How to speak with the LLMs, like remembering to always bring on board the context and knowing which context is important. Also doing good prompt engineering, like even having a set of steps that you would always do. For example, if it's a new code, then say the scaffold and then iterate function by function. Or if it is a bug that you want to fix, then maybe first always put the test, and then from the test that is failing, or whatever the bug report is, and then like put the file tree, for example, if you don't know where to start, or if you do know where to start, then put the specific file, kind of serving this information to the model. This communication skill is something that I would also focus on.
That one's super interesting to me because, so like, I agree. It almost feels like, it almost feels to me like learning to Google things, like in the sense
Sort
that
of.
it was
Yeah.
kind of a joke, like, 10, 15 years ago, especially, that like, being good at Googling things was like a good skill, but like
Mm-hmm.
it really was.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like, would you really take a course on it? You know what I mean? Like, would you really have like a formal setting where you learn to do that? Do you
Yeah.
think prompt engineering is different, where there actually is enough useful things to learn that it should be something that maybe we sit down and create some rules of thumb around?
I think yes. I think just because you have a bit more flexibility, because it's not just the what you put in that line, but also what is the additional information you can throw in. And I would say that in Googling, you have less options of things to throw in. That's why it's not exactly the same, but it's a really good comparison.
Hmm.
Also, search, like I remember at some point in elementary school, we had an explanation from the library on how to search for information in the library.
Like the Dewey Decimal System kind of a thing.
Kind of, you have to go by the subject and then like by this and this. I forget already the details, but I remember that at the time I found it very like, why would I want to know that? Because I had a computer at home.
Oh
But I
yeah.
remember we had this thing. Um, and but I can also understand how in the past it was an important skill, kind of the context. It all goes back to the context.
Yeah. That's also an interesting one to me because it could be that that skill, and I'm not saying that it is, this is just like hypothesis. It could also be that that is a very useful but very short lived skill, because
Hmm.
it's like context. Once the context window gets big enough, you could just like shove everything in there, and now you're back to just like one or two sentence prompts, maybe.
Yeah, but you can always like for sure context will be solved, same as memory of computers is solved, but you can always think of more things to put into the context. Like we speak about putting the code, the repo, how about the documentation? How about like feedback from the website forum? How about from other places? And then it will also help you program when you have choice A or B, the like there's no way you can remember what are all the discussions in the forum, why does it not do like this. But if you can think about putting that as another data point, that's again going to the architecture level a little bit, but putting that as a data point, for example, will help you take this decision better.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that like that will likely be the reality for quite a while, that
Hmm.
will be useful. I'm like, now I'm getting like crazy far in the future. Like imagine an infinitely sized context window where you would just like scaffold a new project, and it has all of the context of your current repo. It has all of the context of every single piece of documentation that your repo might be interested in using. Like I could see getting to a point where, like, again, you might not need to worry about it so much as um it's just like included in the scaffolding of the project, like when you start the project, maybe like it's almost like project configuration settings or something.
Could be. But like when you say that, I'm thinking of when the internet was introduced and everybody's like, wow, at the palm of my hand, I can access all the knowledge of the world. And you know how the meme goes, right? Like we waste all this computation power that is stronger than spaceships is like on memes. So
Yeah, yeah, just sharing
whatever
cat
the
pictures.
equivalent, exactly, whatever the equivalent of the infinite context window will be, that
We
you'll be
will waste the
surprised.
infinite context
Exactly.
window. Yeah, there's no
Exactly.
chance we use it responsibly. Google Chrome will just run within the infinite context window, and it'll be slower than ever.
Cats all the way.
Oh man. Okay, this has been super fun. Thanks again for coming on. Is there any last bits of wisdom that you'd like to share with budding backend developers, um, in regards to AI and how it's going to change the development landscape over the next, say, decade?
Use it even when you don't think you need it. Just give it a try. Even
Use
in
it
life
even when you
scenario,
don't
all
think you need it.
scenarios when you cannot, like when you don't, where you're not in first immediate reaction, is go and try that.
Keep trying
Give it
it.
a try, yeah, and see. Maybe it's irrelevant, and then try again in a couple of months. Maybe it changed.
I like that. I like that a lot. I think at the very least, try to get out of the emotional headspace, right? The emotions of the fear and the, is this going to take my job? I think
Hmm.
trying to at least get the emotions out of the way and just see if there's anything in your life that that it can make more productive. I'm very on board with that. Thanks so much. Where can people find you online? Go ahead and plug anything that you
On
want.
Twitter, that's my first name, Natalie, Natalie, and then PIS.
Perfect. Amazing. Thanks again, Natalie. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you so much.